Let's go back. I'm also on the board at Butterfly Conservation Europe, but I'm only mentioning that as an excuse to show species from Europe, and some nice landscapes as well. So it's grassland management for butterflies. I've changed it slightly. Sorry, Brian. And I think really I'm here today just to emphasise some of the points that others have made over the last 2 days. I am going to say nothing original in this talk, which is a bit of a shock for me, but you know, let's re-emphasise some important points. This is the false comma, by the way. Anyway, so I'm just going to talk about the importance of grasslands, which I'm sure you all know, some of the threats we've heard about already, and then I'm going to just outline some basic principles, and I know I do think it's not rocket science, grassland management. It is pretty basic stuff. Then I want to talk about landscape scale conservation and why that's important, and then how that theory, if you like, has influenced some conservation work in England, and summarise. So, across Europe, grasslands hold the majority of species. Somebody asked me yesterday, what do I do? And I said, I work on grasslands and woodlands. And that pie diagram explains why I work on grasslands and woodlands. I do a bit of heathland work as well, but that's because I like it. Anyway, so one of the main threats to grasslands, and we've heard a lot about this, the key one functioning at the moment, working there, is absolutely abandonment. If you're a hard-pressed farmer, you can do two things. You can improve, invest and improve, or you can abandon. And that's happening across Europe and has been for many years, and particularly, obviously, in the uplands. You've probably all seen these figures before. They're pretty horrific. This is from England. We have lost an awful lot of semi-natural habitat over the last 100 years or so. I think this picture demonstrates the semi-natural grassland that's left in a pretty intensive landscape. And what we need to do is we need to maintain pastoral systems. Now, we've talked a lot about livestock today, but let's not forget that the hay cutting and hay systems have been decimated across Europe, and we need to do our best for them as well. So, about 10 years ago now, we were working with Natural England on our agri-environment scheme. I'm not going to talk much about that, but one of the things we thought we'd do is try and develop the 3 key principles for butterfly management, and particularly farmland butterfly. So we developed this farmland butterfly initiative. Basically, it was working on these 7 priority species, and we were getting the heads up. There's a pipeline of proposals to go into agri-environment, and if these species were present, we got to see them before they were approved, check the management. So in theory, that sounds brilliant. It didn't work brilliantly, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the basic principles. So we came up with the big 3. What do you need to maintain grasslands for butterflies? And I'd like to think lots of other insects as well. The first one was structural variety in the grasslands sward. So we've heard a lot about that. Small patches of bare ground, very important. You deliver that with moderate light grazing. Definitely no sheep grazing in the summer, or if it is, it's very extensive, as we've heard this morning. Okay. The second one was summer nectar. Oh, God, that's rubbish, isn't it? Sorry. I hope you can still... Sorry. Right. Summer nectar. Obviously, abundant flower heads throughout the summer. Again, moderate light cattle grazing, preferably no sheep grazing. I got a letter once, quite a few years ago, from the Sheep Farming Federation in England, complaining that I was anti-sheep. And I didn't know how to respond, because I am. Anyway, I mean, they do some important stuff as well. Anyway, and the third one is the importance of scrub, which again I think has been a big theme over the last 2 days. Scatter scrub on grassland or scrub patches of various sizes and ages, and you obviously retain that by rotational management. So it's, as I say, it's not rocket science, but these principles will maintain the butterflies on your grasslands. The first one was about heterogeneity in the management. And this is quite an old graph now, although we've modified it slightly. And it basically lists most of the grassland species in the UK, and it shows that the turf height that they require for successful breeding is very variable. So you've got the Adonis blue, which requires an incredibly tightly grazed piece of grassland, chalk grassland, compared to the Lord skipper at the bottom there, which prefers not to be on grazed grasslands at all. And I'm mentioning those two extremes and all the things in between. I'm mentioning those two extremes for a good reason, which I'll come to in a minute. So grazing heterogeneity and variety can be delivered in various ways. Livestock type, obviously, as I think we've heard this morning, cattle do different things to sheep. They give you a different impact. Ponies are good for restoration, that sort of thing. The intensity, timing and seasonality of grazing, and the system, whether it's extensive, whether you pulse graze on rotation, or in the European mountainous context, transhumans. These systems all produce heterogeneity in the landscape, which is what we need. And obviously overgrazing will reduce that diversity, and undergrazing produces woodland eventually. So another key principle is disturbance and the importance of disturbance, which perhaps is something that we've not heard too much about over the last 2 days. This is my only picture of some limestone grassland. It's Portland in Dorset, where I live. And this was a £2 million project that we were part of to effectively remove Cotoneaster. I think Brian mentioned Cotoneaster quite early on. Get on top of it now, because if you don't, you're just going to spend much more money. It's a pest. Anyway, but we used the opportunity to create these scrapes for silver-studded blues, to scrape back the soil to produce this bare ground, and then you can see the food plant, and this is what the butterfly requires. And avoid uniform management. So I remember years ago listening to some Czech ecologists, butterfly ecologists, complaining about agri-environment schemes at a time when I was giving lots of talks saying how brilliant they could be. And the reason why was because their scheme, which was new, said that every farmer had to cut his hayfield on the 17th of July every year. And that's what they did. And it didn't matter whether it was an early season or a late season. Don't do that. Listen to the farmers and do the right thing. Do it accordingly. So that variability in management helps deliver a variable landscape. And again, mosaics are really crucial. Resourcing range habitat type, some species, as we've heard yesterday, brilliant talk, scrub edge is really important. So it's that variability. And although nectar is not usually a component that determines the size of populations, it's a clearly important component in the butterfly's life. And landscapes provide the habitat diversity. So here we have some really tightly grazed grasslands for silver-spotted skipper, which was at the top end of that graph. It requires a very tightly grazed grassland. We've got some scrub edge in a slightly less grazed field, which has got Duke of Burgundy in it. And obviously we've got the oak woodland for the purple hairstreak. So moving to a landscape is important just because of the diversity that that again gives us. So I'm going to talk a bit about landscape scale conservation now, which I think has become a very common approach. And in England, the UK, John Lawton published this very influential report in 2010 called Making Space for Nature, where he talked about the need for bigger, better and more joined up. And we produced this report a couple of years later, which showed how we were delivering bigger, better and more joined up for butterflies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what influenced our report at least. I wouldn't claim to have influenced John Lawton. So I'm very proud of this graph, I have to say, and I present it a lot. So I'm going to spend a bit of time on it, and it's Adonis blue and Lord skipper. So the Adonis blue requires tight, short vegetation. its food plant, Lotus caniculatus, is required. It needs to be very short for them to lay their eggs, basically. And the Northern skipper, which is on Brachypodium pinnatum, which I know has changed its name, but I can remember where's Tim. He gave the right name. It needs to be very quiet, very tall, up to about 20 to 30 centimetres tall. So the management for those two is very different. They occur in the same place, but on very different sites. And each one of these spots is a site. And basically, if you are on the right of the graph, then at the bottom, those sites are very isolated. And if you're high on the left, you've got the food plant growing in the right growth form. So the habitat quality of those sites, all of those sites, is better. And basically, the chance of being occupied is much greater if the site you've got is close to one another, and if the habitat quality is high. And we did this for several species, just protect those two, and that was a uniform thing. And what it demonstrates is the importance, really, of the metapopulation functioning, how that works in terms of the quality of the habitat, because you produce so many more individuals on a good habitat. So therefore, they're important sites. Those are the numbers that showed that. I mean, what I was really hoping for was to show the importance of area, because I think area is important. But in this system, it didn't really come through very strongly. It was all about the habitat quality. So now I want to just talk very briefly about a conservation project that we've been running since 2005 on Dartmoor for the Mars Artillery. I'm going to talk very small about it. It's actually a project, became the Three Moors project. So we were working on Dartmoor, Bodmin Moor, and Exmoor for a range of species. I'm just going to talk about Mars Artillery for very good reasons, I think. It's in this purple moorgrass soft rust pasture. It feeds on devil's bit scabious, which we saw plenty of yesterday. And obviously it's managed by grazing and scrub control. Now, within Dartmoor, there are these 4 valley systems that come down. So the moors are all protected. These valley grasslands, with this really important European protected species, is undesignated and has suffered from all the issues about grasslands, about abandonment and intensification. So I'm just going to talk about the Fenworthy Long Lane system, but I could easily talk about the other 4. I think I've said all that, really. So, project started in 2005, working very closely with Natural England I'm sorry, I keep doing that. Working very closely with Natural England, 15 farmers in this system, 20 habitat patches, and we've provided cash for fencing to restore grazing. We've obviously helped introduce Dartmoor ponies, opened up flight routes to improve the connectivity by targeting where you do the scrub management, obviously the scrub management stuff, and worked, particularly in the later years of the project, worked very closely with volunteers because the agri-environment scheme money became a bit more of an issue. So I just want to show what that looked like on map. Now, in 2005, the Mars Artillery just contracted to just 3 sites, the blue, 4 sites, I think, actually, the 4 figures. By 2015, after working with these farmers and changing the management, we'd increased the habitat by 46 hectares, and 16 patches, 15 patches have become occupied. And now that's not with reintroductions or anything, that is just natural colonisation. Because we've got the management, we've improved the habitat quality across the landscape, basically. And just to bring you up to date, it's still, even though our agri-environment system in England is in, well, depending what mood I'm in, I'd argue it's in tatters. But despite that, we're maintaining this system, but mainly now through volunteers, and the volunteers are helping the local farmers. But key thing, perhaps the connectivity between sites has been reduced by that targeted scrub management and by colonisations. So sites are nearer together. Perhaps occupancy is obviously increased, and the habitat quality is improved. And it's doing better now in that system, the Marsh Artillery, than it is in the rest of the UK. So this is the results of the UK BMS. It shows Marsh Artillery with a slight decline over the last, since the length of the project, since 2005. I thought that would be appropriate to show. But you can see the top line there is the Marsh Artillery in the system. On Dartmoor, actually all 4 systems. And it's doing much better in Dartmoor than elsewhere. And I like to think that's directly down to the project and the project officer. So what have we learned from this 2 Moors project? Other than the fact that funding is always dodgy, so it had to become all the more projects to get more funding and maintain it. And we've managed to maintain it for 17 years, although the last 2 or 3 have been really difficult. So we've done pretty well. But that sustained effort is essential. It takes time to, requires long-term funding to work, to deliver this sort of long-term management. And I think we heard this morning, brilliant talk, skilled advisors are absolutely crucial. You've got to work with the community. You've got to work to build strong landowner relations, to deliver that habitat management advice for them to then take up or not. And also, it's a bit like reducing the paperwork. If you manage the contractors that are doing some of the work, that helps. Simple, isn't it, really? And working with the local community to provide training and build that continuity. And something that, local volunteers, because they're there, you're engendering an interest in the project, they'll keep it going. So even though the project officer has got much more other things to do at the moment, funding is not as good, we know things are still going on because the volunteers are still keeping it going. And I think we heard this morning as well, that networking between landowners is absolutely essential. I mentioned Tony Astor on Portland. Action now is cheaper than later. I've done it again, sorry. Absolutely, scrub becomes woodland. Scrub expands. If you don't do it when when it's manageable, it'll just cost more. The Tony Astor project on Portland was 2 million, and it's still an issue. And obviously monitoring is essential as well, because you measure success, or you measure the need to do something different, perhaps. And obviously, I think you'd expect me to say that other species benefit too from habitat quality, from the improvement in habitat quality. And I think I've already said, working with the local community engenders that continuity, helps develop that continuity. And partnerships are essential. It's not just funding partnerships, the community, farmers, etc. Absolutely essential, because, all of this land is privately owned. So I just want to conclude. How am I doing for time? I'm doing all right. To conclude, grasslands across Europe are biodiversity hotspots. I'm not going to say anything here now that you haven't already heard. Under and over management, abandonment and improvement are still major threats across Europe. Principles of management, heterogeneity, both in terms of habitat and in terms of sward, is important for a whole range of Lepidoptera, but I think the butterflies exemplify that. And delivery through different stock types, different systems, timing and intensity is vital. And we need to work at a landscape scale, because there's an inbuilt heterogeneity within the landscape, but also targeted management can deliver much, much more. And while I haven't mentioned it today, in fact, it hasn't been mentioned, I don't think, in the last 2 days, this is key to climate adaptation as we go forward. And I hope with the case study and the lessons learned that the principles are being used to deliver with appropriate financial and expert support over a long time. And partnership's not a fad, it's absolutely essential. There we go, I don't know why I wrote that. Must have been feeling under pressure. And I think, other than thank you very much for inviting me, I've loved it. This is my 4th visit to the Burn, and every time it's sunny and every time it's brilliant. Thank you.
And on that note, we'll have to invite you back again if you bring this kind of weather with you. We have time for one question. Something in-house here.
Just you mentioned there was a lot of heavy mention on grazers to help manage grassland health and heterogeneity. But I'm much more interested from like towns and local councils about tiny towns and investing in biodiversity in smaller patches in villages, in areas that might not be friendly to grazers. Is there kind of a change to recommend them, or what's the kind of advice that you might be giving to those kind of communities that don't have the option of using grazers to help encourage heterogeneity in those kind of patches?
Always cut and collect would be my top advice. If you are, if you're managing a roadside furze or a village green or anything, cut and collect. You've got to remove the nutrients. It's an issue, but you've got to do it. And vary it, I mean, not crazily, but I mean, end of what you think is the season, and the plants have set seed, that's when you cut. That would be my advice, basically.